The summer of 1939 carried an electric tension across Europe, a collective holding of breath before the deluge. In Berlin, swastika banners hung from every building, proclaiming a new order. In London, gas masks were distributed to civilians who couldn't quite believe war would come again, just 2 decades after the war to end all wars. In Warsaw, soldiers drilled in city squares while mothers clutched their children closer. And in 1,000 small towns across the continent, young men looked at the reflections and wondered if they would live to see another summer. The world stood at a precipice, unaware that it was about to plunge into the most devastating conflict in human history, a war that would consume over 70 million lives and reshape civilization itself.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
The invasion came at dawn on September 1st, 1939. Lieutenant Kazimierz Nowak stood in the observation tower along the Polish corridor, binoculars pressed to his eyes, when he saw them. Thousands upon thousands of gray-uniformed soldiers pouring across the border like a steel tide. The blitzkrieg had begun. "Get to your posts!" he shouted, though his voice seemed impossibly small against the roar of aircraft engines overhead. Junkers Ju-87 Stukas screamed down from the sky, their sirens wailing like banshees, dropping bombs that shook the earth and turned buildings into rubble. Within hours, the communications lines were cut. Within days, Warsaw was surrounded. Across Europe, the dominoes had been set up carefully by Adolf Hitler over the previous years. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, the seizure of Czechoslovakia, each violation of the Treaty of Versailles had been met with appeasement and hollow protests. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had returned from Munich waving a paper and promising peace for our time. But the paper meant nothing. Hitler wanted more than peace. He wanted Lebensraum, living space for the German people carved from Eastern Europe. In London, Prime Minister Chamberlain sat in the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street, his face ashen. Britain and France had guaranteed Polish independence. Honor and treaty obligations left no choice. On September 3rd, with a voice heavy with resignation, Chamberlain announced to the British people via radio, "This country is at war with Germany." But the British Expeditionary Force and French armies that mobilized did little to help Poland. They sat behind the Maginot Line, France's supposedly impregnable fortifications, in what would be mockingly called the Phony War or Sitzkrieg. Meanwhile, from the east, the Soviet Union, operating under the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded Poland on September 17th. Caught between 2 totalitarian giants, Poland was crushed within weeks. Lieutenant Nowak fought until the ammunition ran out, then melted into the resistance that would continue fighting in the shadows for the next 6 years. The conquest of Poland revealed the devastating effectiveness of German military doctrine. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined rapid armor advances with close air support and motorized infantry, bypassing strong points to strike deep into enemy territory, surrounding and paralyzing defending forces. It was warfare revolutionized, and Europe was unprepared. Through the winter of 1939-1940, an uneasy quiet settled over Western Europe. French soldiers played cards in the Maginot Line bunkers. British families sent their children to the countryside to escape anticipated bombing raids that hadn't yet materialized. In Berlin, Hitler and his generals prepared the next phase. On April 9, 1940, Germany launched Operation Weserübung, invading Denmark and Norway simultaneously. Denmark fell in hours, offering only token resistance. Norway fought back fiercely, but despite British and French intervention, superior German air power and the audacity of the German plan, including the first major airborne assault in history, secured victory within 2 months. The Allies had been outmaneuvered again. The real blow came on May 10, 1940. As dawn broke, German forces invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The Allies rushed north to meet them, exactly as German planners had anticipated. The main German thrust came through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, where French defenses were lightest. General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions burst through at Sedan, driving a wedge between the Allied armies. Captain Jean-Pierre Moreau of the 55th French Infantry Division watched in horror as Stuka bombers screamed overhead, targeting his positions with terrifying precision. "They're behind us!" a sergeant shouted. It seemed impossible. The Germans had just broken through the day before, yet already their tanks were racing toward the English Channel, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and the best French divisions. In London, Winston Churchill had just become Prime Minister, replacing the discredited Chamberlain. In his first address to Parliament on May 13th, Churchill promised only blood, toil, tears, and sweat. The situation was more desperate than most Britons realized. Within 2 weeks, the German armored spearheads reached the coast at Abbeville, trapping over 300,000 Allied troops in a shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. What followed was one of the war's great escapes and disasters simultaneously. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, saw the Royal Navy, supported by hundreds of civilian vessels, fishing boats, pleasure craft, lifeboats, ferry troops across the Channel under constant aerial attack. From May 26th to June 4th, over 338,000 soldiers were rescued, but they left behind nearly all their heavy equipment. Britain had saved its army, but it was an army stripped of tanks, artillery, and supplies. Churchill rallied the nation with words that would echo through history. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." But privately, he wondered how Britain could fight at all. France was collapsing. The Wehrmacht drove south and west, brushing aside demoralized French forces. On June 14th, German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées in Paris, which had been declared an open city, to spare it from destruction. The French government fled to Bordeaux. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun in the previous war, now aged and defeatist, negotiated an armistice. France was divided. The north under German occupation, the south governed by Pétain's collaborationist Vichy regime. General Charles de Gaulle, a junior minister who had escaped to London, made a broadcast to the French people on June 18th. "France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war." It was a lonely voice of defiance. Most believed the war in the West was over. Britain now stood alone. Across the Channel, Hitler prepared Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But first, Germany needed air superiority. In July 1940, the Battle of Britain began. The Luftwaffe launched waves of bombers escorted by fighters against British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The RAF, outnumbered and fighting over home territory, mounted a desperate defense. Flight Lieutenant David Hayes climbed into his Spitfire at RAF Biggin Hill for the 3rd time that day. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. Oil smudges marked his face where he'd wiped away sweat. At 22, he felt ancient. 3 of his squadron's mates had been shot down that week. He'd watched Jimmy's Hurricane spiral into the Kent countryside in flames. There had been no parachute. "Tally-ho!" came the call over the radio. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high!" Hayes pushed the throttle forward, climbing toward the formation of Heinkel bombers with their escort of Messerschmitt Bf-110s. The sky erupted in tracer fire and explosions. A bomber fell, trailing smoke, then another. But more kept coming. The battle raged through the summer. British pilots flew multiple sorties daily, sustained by tea, cigarettes, and sheer will. The ground crews worked miracles keeping damaged aircraft airworthy. The radar stations, British technology that gave crucial early warning, proved vital. And the Luftwaffe made a critical mistake. In early September, in retaliation for RAF raids on Berlin, Hitler ordered the focus shifted from military targets to London and other cities. The Blitz had begun, bringing terror to civilians, but giving the RAF's battered airfields time to recover. Night after night, German bombers droned over London. Air raid sirens wailed. People crowded into underground stations converted to shelters. Families huddled together as bombs whistled down and the city shook. In the morning, Londoners emerged to find streets turned to rubble, water mains burst, gas fires burning. Yet they carried on, epitomizing the keep calm and carry on spirit, though that particular poster was rarely actually displayed during the war. Sarah Brennan, a nurse at St. Thomas Hospital, worked 18-hour shifts treating casualties. The wounded kept coming. Burns, crush injuries, shrapnel wounds. "Will it ever end?" asked a young doctor, his face gray with fatigue. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. "We'll make an end," she said with more confidence than she felt. "We have to." By late October, it became clear that the Luftwaffe could not achieve air superiority. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. Britain had survived, though the Blitz continued into 1941, expanding to other cities: Coventry, Liverpool, Plymouth, Bristol. Over 43,000 civilians would die in the bombing campaign, and over 1 million houses were destroyed or damaged. But Britain remained in the war, an unsinkable aircraft carrier off Europe's coast, a beacon of resistance. Yet Britain's position remained precarious. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, threatening to starve Britain into submission. The Battle of the Atlantic would prove the war's longest continuous campaign, and Hitler's gaze was already turning eastward to the vast expanse of the Soviet Union and the ultimate prize of his racial ideology. The year 1940 ended with Europe under Nazi domination from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the borders of the Soviet Union. Only Britain fought on, along with its empire and the governments in exile gathered in London. In America, President Franklin D. Roosevelt pushed through the Lend-Lease program, providing supplies to Britain while officially remaining neutral, understanding that American security depended on Britain's survival. The arsenal of democracy was awakening, though America itself was not yet at war. The darkness was deepening, but the first glimmers of eventual dawn were forming, though few could see them yet.
The year 1941 transformed a European war into a truly global conflict that would consume continents and decide the fate of humanity. Two decisions, one by Hitler, one by Japan, would ultimately seal the Axis powers' doom, though this was far from obvious at the time. In the Balkans, the year began with more German victories. Mussolini's Italy had invaded Greece from Albania in October 1940, expecting an easy conquest. Instead, the Greeks had counterattacked successfully, pushing the Italians back into Albania. Humiliated, Mussolini required German assistance. In April 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece, once again demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg. Yugoslavia surrendered within 11 days. Greece, despite British intervention, fell within 3 weeks. German paratroopers captured Crete in the war's first major airborne invasion, though at such heavy cost that Hitler never again authorized a major airborne operation. But these were sideshows to Hitler's great obsession: the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval German emperor, was the largest military operation in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by troops from Romania, Hungary, Italy, and Finland, organized into 3 massive army groups. The objective was nothing less than the destruction of the Soviet Union and the enslavement or extermination of its Slavic peoples. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the invasion began along an 1,800-mile front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Soviet border guards were overwhelmed. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in vast battles of annihilation. The Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, many caught on the ground. German panzer divisions drove deep into Soviet territory, advancing sometimes 50 miles in a day. Major Dmitry Volkov of the Red Army's 15th Mechanized Corps climbed from the burning wreckage of his T-34 tank, his uniform scorched, his ears ringing from the explosion. Around him, the Ukrainian steppe was a vision of hell. Burning vehicles, cratered earth, the dead and dying scattered like broken dolls. His entire division had been ordered to counterattack. They'd driven straight into German anti-tank guns and airstrikes. Within hours, it had ceased to exist as a fighting force. "Fall back," an officer shouted. But fall back to where? The Germans seemed to be everywhere. Volkov grabbed a rifle from a fallen soldier and joined the stream of retreating men. Overhead, a Stuka scream announced another attack. Volkov threw himself flat as bombs churned the earth. The Red Army reeled from the assault, but it did not collapse entirely. Stalin, initially paralyzed by shock, he had ignored numerous warnings of the impending attack, recovered and organized resistance. The Soviet system's ruthlessness now worked in its favor. Retreating officers were shot as traitors. Units were ordered to fight to the death. Factories were dismantled and moved east, beyond the Urals, where they would continue producing tanks and weapons. A scorched earth policy denied resources to the advancing Germans, and the Soviet Union's greatest weapons, distance and winter, began to work their ancient magic. By September, German Army Group North had reached Leningrad, beginning a siege that would last 872 days and kill over 1 million people through starvation and bombardment. Army Group South took Kiev in a massive encirclement that netted over 600,000 prisoners, and Army Group Center drove toward Moscow, the greatest prize. In October, Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, began. German commanders could see the Kremlin spires through their binoculars. Soviet officials were evacuated to Kuyshev. But Stalin remained in Moscow, and so did the defenders. General Georgy Zhukov, recalled from Leningrad, organized the defense. And the weather intervened. October rains turned roads to mud. November brought early snow, and December delivered temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees. The Germans, expecting a quick victory, had not prepared for winter warfare. Soldiers wrapped themselves in newspaper for insulation. Tank engines wouldn't start. Lubricants froze. Frostbite claimed thousands. Meanwhile, Soviet forces, equipped for winter, received reinforcements. Fresh Siberian divisions, released from the east because Soviet spy Sors Sargey confirmed Japan would not attack from Manchuria, but was looking south instead. On December 5th, Zhukov launched a counteroffensive. German forces, exhausted and overextended, were driven back from Moscow's outskirts in the Wehrmacht's first major defeat. The myth of German invincibility was broken. The war in the East had become a struggle of attrition that Germany, for all its initial successes, was not positioned to win. But if Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was a colossal strategic error, Japan's decision to attack the United States was equally catastrophic for the Axis cause. Japan had been at war in China since 1937, bogged down in a conflict that consumed resources and men without achieving victory. The Japanese military, dominated by an expansionist ideology, saw opportunity in European colonial powers' weakness. Germany's victories had left British, French, and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia vulnerable. Japan wanted their resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, and rice from Indochina. The obstacle was the United States. As Japan expanded southward, occupying Indochina in 1941, President Roosevelt imposed an oil embargo. Japan imported 80% of its oil from America. Without oil, the military machine would grind to a halt within months. Negotiations were attempted, but positions were irreconcilable. America demanded Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina. Japan refused to abandon its empire. The Japanese military planned a bold gamble. neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a surprise attack, seize Southeast Asia's resources in a rapid campaign, then establish a defensive perimeter so strong that America would negotiate peace rather than pay the cost of breaking through. It was a strategy based on underestimating American industrial potential and national will. Seaman First Class James Morrison stood on the deck of the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, enjoying the peaceful Hawaiian Sunday. At 7:55 a.m., he heard a droning sound and looked up to see aircraft diving toward Battleship Row. "Is that some kind of drill?" he wondered aloud. Then he saw the red circles on the wings and the bombs falling. "This is no drill," someone screamed. "Battle stations!" Morrison ran for his station, but he never made it. A bomb pierced the Arizona's deck and detonated in the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion tore the ship apart, sending a mushroom cloud of fire and smoke 1,000 feet into the air. Morrison and 1,176 of his shipmates died in minutes. The ship's wreckage still lies in Pearl Harbor, a tomb and memorial.
For 2 hours, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor in 2 waves. They sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed over 180 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. It was a tactical success, but a strategic catastrophe. The Japanese had missed the aircraft carriers, which were at sea. They had failed to destroy the harbor's fuel storage and repair facilities, and they had awakened a sleeping giant. President Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war with only one dissenting vote. Germany and Italy, honoring their tripartite pact with Japan, declared war on the United States on December 11th. Hitler made this decision casually, believing America weak and decadent, distracted by war in the Pacific. It was perhaps his greatest miscalculation. America's industrial and demographic might, once fully mobilized, would prove decisive. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Japan achieved stunning successes. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila was captured. The supposedly impregnable British fortress of Singapore surrendered in February 1942, in Britain's worst military defeat, with 80,000 troops marching into captivity. The Dutch East Indies were conquered. Burma fell, cutting the Burma Road that supplied China. Japan seemed invincible. Lieutenant Kobayashi Takeshi of the Imperial Japanese Navy stood on the deck of the carrier Akagi, watching planes return from yet another successful strike. The capture of Singapore had exceeded his most optimistic hopes. Surely America would see reason now, would negotiate peace. Japan had secured the resources it needed. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan's euphemism for its empire, was becoming reality. But already, cracks were appearing in the Japanese edifice. The strategy required defending a vast perimeter with limited resources. American submarines were beginning to take a toll on Japanese merchant shipping, and America was not negotiating. It was mobilizing on a scale the world had never seen. Factories that had built cars were now building tanks and aircraft. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rationing ensured resources went to war production. The arsenal of democracy that had supplied Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease was now gearing up for total war. By the end of 1941, the battle lines were drawn. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, controlled vast territories from France to the Central Pacific, from North Africa to the Dutch East Indies. Against them stood the Allies. Britain and its empire, the Soviet Union fighting desperately for survival, China resisting Japanese occupation, and now the United States. Its power still potential, but growing. The year had transformed a European conflict into a war that touched every continent and ocean. Over 30 million people were now mobilized. Entire economies had been converted to war production. And the worst was yet to come.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The year 1942 marked the Axis powers' high water mark and the beginning of their inexorable decline, though participants could not see this clearly at the time. 3 battles, Midway, El Alamein, and Stalingrad, would later be recognized as turning points, but in the moment they seemed only bright spots in a continuing struggle whose outcome remained uncertain. In the Pacific, Japan continued its expansion through spring 1942. Port Moresby in New Guinea was targeted, which would threaten Australia. But American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, knew Japanese intentions. In May, American and Japanese carriers clashed in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle where the opposing ships never sighted each other, fought entirely by aircraft. It was a tactical draw, but a strategic American victory. The invasion of Port Moresby was turned back. More significantly, American intelligence learned that Japan planned to invade Midway Island, a vital American base in the Central Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned Pearl Harbor, brought the bulk of the Japanese fleet, including 4 fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, to ambush the Japanese fleet. Ensign George Gay was a torpedo bomber pilot aboard Hornet. On June 4, his squadron was ordered to attack the Japanese carriers. Flying slow, obsolete Devastators, they approached without fighter escort. Japanese Zeros fell on them like wolves. Gay watched his squadron mate shot down one by one. He dropped his torpedo, it missed, and his plane was hit. He crashed into the ocean, the sole survivor of his squadron. Clinging to a seat cushion, he watched the battle unfold. American dive bombers arriving just after the torpedo attacks had pulled the Japanese fighters down to sea level, caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable, planes being refueled and rearmed on deck. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were turned into burning wrecks. Later that day, Hiryu was also destroyed. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and many of its most experienced pilots. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted irrevocably. But Japan's forces still controlled a vast empire and were far from defeated. In August, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning a 6-month campaign of savage jungle fighting, naval battles, and attrition. The Marines held Henderson Field airstrip against repeated Japanese assaults. British soldiers prepared for the offensive around him, checking weapons, writing letters home, some sleeping with the exhausted fatigue of men who knew battle was coming. At night, the massive artillery barrage began. The earth shook, the sky lit with muzzle flashes. For hours the bombardment continued. Then the infantry and tanks advanced. The Battle of El Alamein was a grinding, 12-day battle of attrition. Rommel's forces, outnumbered and short on fuel, fought skillfully but were overwhelmed. On November 4th, Rommel received Hitler's order, "Stand fast, yield not a yard of ground, victory or death." Rommel, understanding this meant the destruction of his army, ignored the order and retreated. It was the beginning of the Axis collapse in North Africa. In November, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. Caught between Montgomery advancing from the east and the Americans from the west, Axis forces in North Africa were doomed, finally surrendering in May 1943. But the decisive turning point of the war occurred in the frozen ruins of a city on the Volga River. Stalingrad had been a bustling industrial city of 400,000 people. By September 1942, when the battle began in earnest, it was a shattered landscape of rubble and ruins. Its importance was partly strategic. It was a vital industrial and transportation hub, but even more symbolically, it bore Stalin's name. German Sixth Army, commanded by General Paulus, advanced into the city. Soviet forces, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, defended every building, every floor, every room. The battle fragmented into thousands of small unit actions. A strategic map showing broad arrows gave no sense of the reality, fighting floor by floor in apartment buildings, sewers used as supply routes, snipers picking off targets in the rubble, artillery reducing buildings to dust, soldiers living and dying in basements and ruins. Private Yakov Pavlov led a platoon that captured an apartment building overlooking a square. For 58 days, his small group held Pavlov's house against repeated German assaults. They were resupplied at night over open ground swept by machine gun fire. They mined the approaches, fortified the walls, and fought with desperate ferocity. German officers later remarked they lost more men taking Pavlov's house than they had taking Paris. German Lancer Hans Werner wrote in his diary, "We have been fighting for 2 weeks for a single house. The front is a corridor between burned-out rooms. It is the thin ceiling between 2 floors. We are defending the staircase landing as if it were a close combat tower. Our battalion has fought for the same factory for over a month, but we still haven't captured it. How much longer can this go on?" By November, the Germans had pushed Soviet defenders into a narrow strip along the Volga River, but they could not advance any further. Their offensive strength was exhausted. Meanwhile, Zhukov had been planning a massive counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. On November 19th, Soviet forces attacked the weak Romanian armies protecting the German flanks north and south of the city. Within 4 days, they had linked up west of Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was encircled. Paulus requested permission to break out. Hitler refused. "Stand fast, I won't leave the Volga." An air supply operation was attempted but failed. The Luftwaffe couldn't deliver the required 500 tons of supplies daily. Conditions in the pocket deteriorated. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees. Rations were cut, then cut again. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Wounded men froze to death in makeshift hospitals. Typhus spread. An attempted relief operation by Army Group Don failed to break through. On January 31, 1943, Paulus, newly promoted to Field Marshal, a rank from which no German had ever surrendered anyway. Over 90,000 frozen, starving German and Axis soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Only about 5,000 would ever return home. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered beyond repair. Germany had suffered its greatest defeat. More significantly, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Stalin wanted a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on Soviet forces. Churchill and Roosevelt agreed in principle, but argued about timing and location. The Americans favored a direct assault on France. The British, remembering the slaughter of World War I and having been thrown off the continent twice already, wanted to attack through the Mediterranean, what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. The compromise was the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, followed by the invasion of mainland Italy in September. Sicily fell in 5 weeks. Mussolini was overthrown and arrested in a coup. Italy's new government negotiated an armistice, but German forces quickly occupied the country. The Allies landed at Salerno and began the slow, bloody advance up the Italian peninsula. Italy would prove no soft underbelly. The mountainous terrain favored defense, and German forces under Field Marshal Kesselring conducted a masterful defensive campaign. Rome wouldn't fall until June 1944, and northern Italy remained in German hands until April 1945.
At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its crisis in early 1943. U-boats operating in wolf packs were sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. In March, they sank 120 ships. But the Allies deployed new technologies and tactics, improved radar and sonar, long-range aircraft to cover the mid-Atlantic gap, escort carriers providing air cover to convoys, breaking German codes more effectively. By May, U-boat losses became unsustainable. Admiral Donitz withdrew them from the North Atlantic. The crisis was over. The Atlantic supply line to Britain was secure. In the air, the combined bomber offensive, British Bomber Command attacking by night, U.S. 8th Air Force by day, steadily increased in intensity. The bombing campaign was controversial then and remains so. Did it effectively disrupt German war production, or did it waste resources better used elsewhere? Did it break civilian morale or strengthen German resolve? What is clear is its cost. Over 120,000 Allied aircrew became casualties. Hamburg was incinerated in a firestorm in July 1943, killing 42,000 civilians. Yet German war production actually increased through 1944. though it would have increased more without the bombing, and the campaign did force Germany to divert substantial resources to air defense. By late 1943, the trajectory of the war was becoming clear. Germany, Italy, and Japan were on the defensive everywhere. Soviet forces advanced relentlessly westward, recapturing Kharkov and Kiev. Allied forces controlled North Africa and southern Italy. American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, each island taken in brutal combat. Tarawa's three-day battle cost 3,300 American casualties. The noose was tightening, but the Axis powers thought on, and the bloodiest fighting still lay ahead. D-Day arrived with gray skies and rough seas on June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was the largest amphibious assault in history. 156,000 troops landed on 5 beaches, supported by over 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. Years of planning, deception operations to mislead Germans about the landing site, and the accumulated might of American industry had made this moment possible. Private First Class Robert Capa, a photographer, not the soldier, waded ashore at Omaha Beach with the first wave. Through his camera lens, he captured images that would define the invasion. Men taking cover behind beach obstacles, explosions sending up plumes of sand and water, landing craft burning, bodies floating in the surf. Later he would write, "The water was cold and the beach still more than 100 yards away. The bullets tore holes in the water around me." Omaha Beach was a killing ground. The beach was overlooked by cliffs where German defenders had positioned machine guns and artillery in fortified bunkers. As landing craft ramps dropped, men were cut down before they could reach the beach. Units became disorganized. Officers were killed. Some men took shelter behind beach obstacles and couldn't move forward. The situation was so dire that General Omar Bradley considered abandoning Omaha Beach and diverting forces elsewhere. But gradually, through the courage of small groups and individuals, the deadlock broke. Bangalore torpedoes blew gaps in the wire. Rangers scaled the cliffs. Destroyers moved dangerously close to shore to provide fire support. By afternoon, the beach was secured, though at terrible cost. Of the roughly 34,000 Americans who landed on Omaha, about 2,400 became casualties. The other beaches went more smoothly. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juneau, and Sword, and Americans at Utah, established their beachheads with fewer casualties. But the battle for Normandy had just begun. German forces, though initially uncertain whether this was the main invasion or a feint, rushed reinforcements to contain the beachhead. The Bouquet, Normandy's small field separated by thick hedgerows and sunken roads, favored defense. Progress was measured in yards, each gained at cost. Sergeant Bill Davidson of the U.S. 29th Infantry Division crouched in a ditch, German machine gun fire cracking overhead. His squad had been pinned down for hours trying to capture a single field. "I'm tired of this hedgerow-to-hedgerow stuff," muttered the soldier beside him. "How many more of these are there?" Thousands, Davidson knew. Thousands more. In late July, Operation Cobra finally broke the stalemate. A massive aerial bombardment saturated German defenses, and American forces broke out of the Normandy bridgehead. General George Patton's Third Army raced through the gap, sweeping across France with the speed of the German blitzkrieg in reverse. Paris was liberated on August 25th. General Charles de Gaulle, who had fled 4 years earlier promising France's eventual liberation, returned to lead a victory parade down the Champs-Élysées. But supply lines were stretched. The rapid advance had outrun logistics. The port of Antwerp was captured but couldn't be used until its approaches were cleared. Operation Market Garden in September, an audacious plan to drop airborne troops to seize bridges across the Rhine and outflank German defenses, ended in failure at Arnhem. A bridge too far, as one British general later put it. The war would not end in 1944. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, was even larger than the Normandy invasion. Launched on June 22nd, the third anniversary of Barbarossa, it destroyed German Army Group Center. Over 400,000 German casualties in 6 weeks. Soviet forces advanced into Poland and the Baltic states. The scale of fighting on the Eastern Front dwarfed the West. More Germans fought in a single Soviet offensive than faced the Western Allies in all of 1944.
Stalin's armies were now liberating territories the Germans had occupied, but they were also occupying new territory. Poland's fate became a source of tension. When the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising against German occupation in August, expecting Soviet support, Stalin ordered his forces to halt on the Vistula. For 63 days, the Poles fought desperately while Soviet forces watched from across the river. The Germans systematically destroyed the city and slaughtered civilians. Over 200,000 Poles died. Stalin's calculation was cynical but clear. The Home Army was loyal to Poland's government in exile in London, not to Moscow. Better to let the Germans eliminate this potential obstacle to Soviet domination of post-war Poland. The brutality of the Eastern Front had reached depths unimaginable in the West. As Soviet forces advanced into formerly occupied territories, they discovered the full scope of Nazi atrocities. The Holocaust, Hitler's final solution to exterminate European Jews, had been implemented with industrial efficiency. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, these names would become synonymous with absolute evil. Soviet soldiers liberating Majdanek in July 1944 found gas chambers and crematorias. Captain Ivan Goncharov walked through the camp in stunned silence, mountains of shoes, children's shoes mixed with adults, warehouses filled with human hair cut from victims before they were gassed. The smell of death hung over everything. "How could human beings do this?" a young soldier asked him, tears streaming down his face. Goncharov had no answer. By war's end, the Holocaust would claim 6 million Jews, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population, along with millions of others, Roma, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, disabled people, political dissidents, homosexuals. The death camps were factories of murder, operating with bureaucratic precision. The world had seen atrocities before, but nothing on this scale, nothing this systematically organized. In the Pacific, American forces were closing on Japan through 2 lines of advance. General Douglas MacArthur, who had fled the Philippines in 1942 promising, "I shall return," was island hopping up the New Guinea coast toward the Philippines. Admiral Nimitz was driving through the Central Pacific, taking islands that would serve as bases for bombing Japan. Each island was defended fanatically. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated that surrender was shameless, fought to the death. The Battle of Saipan in June and July 1944 revealed the fanaticism of Japanese resistance. When the island's fall became inevitable, thousands of Japanese civilians, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture and kill them, committed suicide by jumping off cliffs. American troops watched in horror as families threw their children into the sea before jumping themselves. Over 1,000 civilians died this way. Marine Corporal Eugene Sledge later wrote of the Pacific fighting, "The Japanese fought to win. It was a savage, brutal, inhumane, exhausting, and dirty business. Our code of conduct toward the enemy differed drastically from that prevailing in Europe. We were savages." In October, MacArthur fulfilled his promise, landing on Leyte in the Philippines. The Japanese Navy, in a last desperate gamble, committed its remaining strength to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Over 3 days, 4 separate engagements raged across a vast area. Kamikaze attacks, suicide pilots crashing bomb-laden aircraft into ships, appeared for the first time in significant numbers, a tactic born of desperation. When the battle ended, the Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and numerous other vessels were sunk.
Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans commanded the destroyer USS Johnston. When Japanese battleships bore down on vulnerable American escort carriers, Evans didn't hesitate. He charged the enemy fleet, firing torpedoes and drawing fire to protect the carriers. Johnston was battered by shells from battleships and cruisers, but Evans kept fighting, even as his ship was torn apart. He went down with his ship and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His courage, repeated by other destroyer and escort commanders that day, saved the escort carriers from annihilation. By year's end, the Philippines campaign continued. Manila wouldn't be retaken until March 1945, but Japan's defensive perimeter was crumbling. B-29 Super Fortress bombers, operating from bases in the Marianas, began systematic bombing of Japanese cities. The firebombing campaign would escalate through 1945, causing massive civilian casualties. In Europe, Hitler made one last desperate gamble. On December 16, in the forested Ardennes region, the same area where Germany had broken through in 1940, German forces launched a surprise offensive. The Battle of the Bulge caught American forces off guard. In the confusion of the initial assault, foggy weather grounded Allied aircraft, and German tank columns drove deep into American lines. The town of Bastogne, a crucial road junction, was surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division and other units were surrounded and outnumbered. When the German commander sent a surrender demand, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply: nuts. The surrounded Americans held on through freezing weather and constant attacks. Private First Class Richard Winters led his company in defensive positions around Bastogne. Ammunition was running low. Food was short. Medical supplies were exhausted. The men were freezing in their foxholes, but they held. "We came here to fight," Winters told his men, "and that's exactly what we're going to do." The weather cleared on December 23rd, allowing Allied aircraft to drop supplies and attack German columns. Patton's Third Army, in a remarkable feat of logistics and leadership, disengaged from its positions, turned 90 degrees north, and advanced to relieve Bastogne. By January, the German offensive had been contained and then reversed. It was Germany's last offensive operation of the war. The Germans had achieved initial surprise, but lacked the fuel and resources to sustain the attack. The offensive delayed the Allied advance by several weeks, but achieved nothing strategically. More significantly, it consumed reserves and equipment Germany desperately needed to defend against Soviet advances. As 1944 ended, Germany was being ground down from the east and west. Its cities were being reduced to rubble by bombing. Its armies were in retreat on all fronts. Its economy was sustained only through slave labor from concentration camps and occupied territories. Yet it fought on, held together by Hitler's will, Nazi ideology, fear of retribution, and the totalitarian state's grip on the population. Japan's situation was even more desperate. Its empire was contracting, its navy destroyed, its merchant fleet decimated by American submarines. American forces were approaching the home islands, yet Japan's military leadership spoke of fighting to the last man, woman, and child. The Japanese people were being prepared for Ketsugo, the decisive battle for Japan itself. The end was in sight, but the final act would prove the bloodiest of all. The final year of the war began with the end already visible, but still requiring months of savage combat and unprecedented destruction. Three major developments would define 1945: the Soviet steamroller in the east, the final defeat of Germany, and the atomic bombs that ended the Pacific War. On January 12, Soviet forces launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, a massive attack from the Vistula River in Poland toward Germany itself. The offensive involved over 2 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. German defenses, already weakened by the Ardennes offensive's failure and years of attrition, collapsed. Soviet forces advanced up to 40 kilometers per day, crossing Poland in 3 weeks and reaching the Oder River just 40 miles from Berlin by early February. The Soviet advance revealed landscapes of horror. Concentration and extermination camps were liberated. Auschwitz on January 27th, where Soviet soldiers found 7,000 surviving prisoners, walking skeletons, and evidence of industrial-scale murder. The Nazis had attempted to destroy evidence and evacuate prisoners, forcing them on death marches westward in winter conditions. Thousands died from exposure, starvation, or were shot by guards when they couldn't continue. Captain Anatoly Shapiro entered Auschwitz with the first Soviet troops. He had fought for 4 years, seen death in countless forms, but nothing prepared him for this. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the piles of personal belongings, eyeglasses, suitcases with names carefully written on them, children's toys, a warehouse filled with human hair, 7 tons of it, shaven from victims before they were gassed, to be used in textiles. "We knew the Nazis were evil," he wrote in his diary, "but there are no words. We have defeated monsters." In the West, Allied forces had recovered from the Battle of the Bulge and resumed their offensive. On February 8th, Operation Veritable began, the battle for the Rhineland. Through February and March, Allied forces fought their way to the Rhine River, Germany's last natural defensive barrier. On March 7th, elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, intact. An unexpected stroke of fortune. The bridge was supposed to have been destroyed, but German demolition charges failed. American forces poured across. Within weeks, Allied armies were driving deep into Germany. The Allied advance revealed the scope of Nazi Germany's slave labor system. Millions of forced laborers from across occupied Europe had been worked to death in factories and construction projects. Concentration camps held not only Jews, but political prisoners, resistance fighters, captured partisans, and anyone the Nazi regime deemed undesirable. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and Dachau by British and American forces shocked the soldiers who entered them. General Eisenhower ordered German civilians from nearby towns to be brought to see the camps, to witness what had been done in their name. In the Pacific, American forces invaded Iwo Jima on February 19th. The 8-square-mile volcanic island was needed as an emergency landing field for B-29s bombing Japan. The Japanese commander, General Kuribayashi, had prepared the defense brilliantly. Rather than defending the beaches, he fortified the island with tunnels, bunkers, and hidden positions. The 21,000 Japanese defenders had orders to kill 10 Americans each before dying themselves. The battle lasted 36 days. Every yard was contested. Marines used flamethrowers to clear bunkers. Artillery and naval guns pounded Japanese positions. On February 23rd, Marines raised the American flag on Mount Suribachi, the moment captured in Joe Rosenthal's iconic photograph. But the battle was far from over. Fighting continued for another month. When it ended, nearly 7,000 Americans had been killed and 20,000 wounded. Of the Japanese garrison, only 216 were captured. The rest fought to the death. Pharmacist's mate John Bradley, one of the men who raised the flag on Suribachi, spent the rest of the battle treating wounded Marines. He saw friends torn apart by artillery, burned by flamethrowers, shot by snipers. He worked until he collapsed from exhaustion, then got up and worked more. Years later, he would never speak of the war to his children. The memories were too painful. Okinawa, invaded on April 1st, was worse. Just 350 miles from Japan's main islands, it was considered Japanese home territory. The defense was even more fanatical. Kamikaze attacks reached their peak. Nearly 2,000 suicide sorties struck the invasion fleet, sinking dozens of ships. On land, the battle lasted 82 days. Over 12,000 Americans died, 38,000 wounded. Japanese military casualties exceeded 100,000, and perhaps 150,000 Okinawan civilians died, caught between the armies or killed by Japanese forces who viewed them as potential collaborators. The ferocity of Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima and Okinawa convinced American planners that invading Japan's home islands would be catastrophic. Estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion, projected hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese casualties, military and civilian. The Japanese government was preparing the entire population to resist. Women were being trained with bamboo spears. Children were being taught to strap explosives to themselves and throw themselves under tanks. In Europe, the final act was playing out. Soviet forces encircled Berlin in April. Hitler, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issued orders to non-existent armies, while the city was reduced to rubble around him. The Battle of Berlin was urban warfare at its most intense. Soviet troops fought building by building, floor by floor against SS troops, Hitler Youth, and whoever else could hold a weapon. The carnage was immense. Perhaps 80,000 Soviet soldiers died taking the city. On April 30th, with Soviet soldiers fighting 2 blocks from his bunker, Hitler committed suicide. Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's designated successor, tried to negotiate a surrender to the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviets, hoping to save as many Germans as possible from Soviet captivity. The Allies refused. They demanded unconditional surrender to all Allied powers. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, on May 8th brought celebrations across the Allied world. In London, crowds filled Trafalgar Square and celebrated outside Buckingham Palace. In New York City, Times Square overflowed with jubilant people. In Moscow, Stalin spoke to the Soviet people, acknowledging their tremendous sacrifice. Over 27 million Soviet citizens had died, roughly 14% of the pre-war population. But the celebrations were tempered by the knowledge that the war wasn't over. Japan fought on. The firebombing campaign against Japanese cities had escalated. On the night of March 9-10th, 334 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo, creating a firestorm that killed perhaps 100,000 people, more than either atomic bomb would kill. By summer, most of Japan's major cities had been burned, yet Japan's government refused to surrender, though some officials were quietly seeking negotiated peace terms that would preserve the emperor and avoid occupation. President Roosevelt had died on April 12th, succeeded by Vice President Harry Truman, who learned of the atomic bomb project, the Manhattan Project, only after becoming president. The bomb had been in development since 1942, consuming $2 billion and the work of thousands of scientists and engineers. On July 16th, the first atomic device was tested at Alamondo, New Mexico. It worked. The explosion was equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT. Truman was at the Potsdam Conference with Churchill and Stalin negotiating the post-war settlement. He informed Stalin, vaguely, of a new powerful weapon. Stalin, whose spies had already informed him of the Manhattan Project, seemed unimpressed. The Potsdam Declaration issued on July 26th demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction if it refused. Japan's government debated, but did not respond clearly.
On August 6th, a B-29 named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city was obliterated in an instant. A single bomb destroyed 5 square miles and killed perhaps 80,000 people immediately, with tens of thousands more dying from radiation and injuries in the following weeks. Survivors described a blinding flash, a wall of heat, buildings collapsing, and fire sweeping across the city. Many died from radiation sickness without visible injuries, a new horror.
Michiko Hachiya, a doctor in Hiroshima, wrote in his diary, "Hundreds of injured people who were trying to escape to the hills passed our house. The sight of them was almost unbearable. Their faces and hands were burnt and swollen, and great sheets of skin had peeled away from their tissues to hang down like rags on a scarecrow. They moved like a line of ants. All through the night they went past our house, but this morning they had stopped. I found them lying on both sides of the road so thick that it was impossible to pass without stepping on them." On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with over 1 million troops, crushing the Japanese Kwantung Army in a week. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 immediately. Japan's government was paralyzed. Military leaders wanted to fight on. Civilian officials argued for surrender. Emperor Hirohito, who normally remained above political decisions, intervened decisively, directing that Japan accept the Potsdam Declaration's terms. Even then, military officers attempted a coup to prevent the surrender. The coup failed. On August 15th, Hirohito addressed the Japanese people via radio, the first time most had heard his voice, announcing Japan's surrender. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. General MacArthur, accepting the surrender, spoke of creating a better world, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. The war was over. The most destructive conflict in human history had ended. Estimates vary, but at least 70 million people died, perhaps 80 million. The Soviet Union suffered the most, 27 million dead. China lost perhaps 20 million. Germany lost 7 to 8 million. Poland lost 6 million, nearly 17% of its pre-war population. Japan lost 3 million. The United States, protected by oceans and entering late, lost 420,000. Devastating to American families, but proportionately far less than most combatants. The war had remade the world. Europe lay on ruins. The British and French empires, though technically victorious, were exhausted and would soon dissolve. Germany and Japan were occupied, their militarism destroyed. The United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, their wartime alliance already fraying into the Cold War. The United Nations was established, born from hope that international cooperation could prevent future conflicts. The Holocaust's full scope was revealed, forcing the world to confront the depths of human evil. The atomic bomb had demonstrated weapons of unprecedented destructive power, beginning the nuclear age. Colonial peoples, having fought for the Allied powers, now demanded independence. The old order was gone. A new world was being born from the ashes of the old.
The guns fell silent in 1945, but the war's echoes reverberate still. World War II fundamentally shaped the world we inhabit today, geopolitically, technologically, morally. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Europe was a landscape of ruins. 40 million people were displaced, refugees, survivors of concentration camps, forced laborers, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, prisoners of war. Cities like Warsaw, Dresden, and Tokyo were virtually destroyed. In Germany and Japan, people lived in rubble, scrounging for food. The winter of 1946-47 was particularly harsh. Many who survived the war died in its aftermath from starvation, disease, or exposure. Yet reconstruction began remarkably quickly. The Marshall Plan, announced by U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947, provided over $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe. It was motivated partly by humanitarianism, partly by enlightened self-interest. Prosperous democracies would be better markets and more stable allies than impoverished, unstable states vulnerable to communism. West Germany experienced an economic miracle, transforming from ruins to Europe's strongest economy within 2 decades. Japan, under American occupation and with American assistance, similarly rebuilt and democratized. The war's political consequences were profound. The United States and Soviet Union, having cooperated to defeat fascism, became rivals in the Cold War that would last 4 decades. Europe was divided by Churchill's Iron Curtain. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet domination. The countries liberated by the Red Army became Soviet satellites. Germany was divided into East and West. The division lasted until 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended. Decolonization accelerated after the war. The British, French, Dutch, and Belgian empires dissolved as colonized peoples demanded the freedom for which they had fought. India gained independence in 1947. Indonesia declared independence in 1945 and achieved it after a 4-year struggle. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, African and Asian colonies became independent nations. The process was often violent. The partition of India and Pakistan, the Algerian War of Independence, the Indonesian National Revolution. But the age of European imperialism was ending. The Holocaust forced a moral reckoning. The Nuremberg trials established principles of international law, holding individuals accountable for crimes against humanity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, proclaimed fundamental rights belonging to all people. The State of Israel was established in 1948, creating a homeland for Jewish survivors, but also igniting a conflict that continues today. Never again became a solemn pledge, though genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere demonstrated how difficult preventing atrocity remains. Technologically, the war accelerated innovation. Radar, jet engines, rockets, computers, antibiotics, synthetic materials, all developed or advanced rapidly due to wartime necessity. The V-2 rocket developed by Nazi Germany led to both the space race and intercontinental ballistic missiles. The code-breaking work at Bletchley Park contributed to computer science development. Penicillin, mass-produced during the war, revolutionized medicine. These technologies reshaped post-war life. For the individuals who lived through it, the war left deep psychological scars. Veterans returned with what we now call PTSD, then called shell shock or combat fatigue. Many couldn't speak of their experiences. Entire populations were traumatized. Germany and Japan confronted the shame of what their nations had done, or refused to confront it, a source of ongoing controversy. The generation that fought the war was shaped profoundly by the experience. They had seen humanity's worst, genocide, total war, atomic bombs, but also its best, courage, sacrifice, and solidarity. The lessons of World War II remain relevant. The war demonstrated the dangers of appeasement. When Chamberlain tried to satisfy Hitler's demands at Munich, he only emboldened further aggression. Standing up to tyranny early is easier than confronting it once it becomes powerful. The war showed that democracies, when united and determined, can defeat totalitarianism, though at terrible cost. It revealed both the depths of human cruelty. The Holocaust remains history's starkest example of systematic evil, and the heights of human courage and resilience. The war also showed the dangers of dehumanizing others. Nazi ideology was built on the idea that some humans were Untermenschen, subhuman, and therefore could be enslaved or exterminated without moral qualms. Japanese militarism taught that other Asians were inferior and that surrender was shameful, leading to atrocities against occupied populations and fanatical resistance even when defeat was certain. Propaganda on all sides portrayed enemies as monsters. War always involves dehumanization, but World War II took this to extremes with genocidal consequences. Another lesson concerns the fragility of civilization. Germany in the 1920s was one of the world's most advanced societies, highly educated, culturally sophisticated, scientifically advanced. Within a decade, it had embraced Nazism and committed unprecedented atrocities. The lesson is civilization is a thin veneer over darker impulses, and it can unravel frighteningly quickly under the right or wrong conditions. Democratic institutions, the rule of law, and shared moral values must be actively maintained. They are never guaranteed. The importance of international cooperation and institutions is another key takeaway. The League of Nations failed to prevent World War II because it lacked enforcement mechanisms, and the United States never joined. The United Nations, established in 1945, has had mixed success, but has helped prevent a Third World War. International law, human rights norms, and multilateral institutions, however imperfect, remain crucial for addressing global challenges. Yet perhaps the most important lesson is simply the horror of total war. World War II mobilized entire societies, targeted civilians deliberately, and killed on an unprecedented scale. The firebombing of cities, the atomic bombs, the Holocaust, the siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad. These events demonstrated that modern war, waged with industrial technology and totalitarian organization, produces suffering beyond what previous generations could imagine. The next major war, fought with nuclear weapons, could end human civilization. Today, the last World War II veterans are in their late 90s or older. Soon there will be no one left who remembers the war firsthand. The memory becomes historical rather than living. This makes preserving the lessons even more critical. The Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, the Holocaust museums, the memorials at Normandy, Iwo Jima, Pearl Harbor, Hiroshima, these are places where people can encounter the war's reality and reflect on its meaning. The war's central message is both dark and hopeful. The dark message: humans are capable of extraordinary cruelty, and civilization can collapse into barbarism. Tens of millions can be killed in a conflict driven by nationalism, racism, and the lust for power. Weapons of mass destruction can devastate cities in moments. The hopeful message is tyranny can be defeated by people of courage and determination. Societies can rebuild from ruins. Enemies can become friends. Germany, Japan, and Italy are now peaceful democracies and close American allies. Former battlegrounds are now united in organizations like the European Union, founded explicitly to prevent future wars. World War II was humanity's at its worst and its best. It showed what people will do to each other in the name of ideology, race, or national glory. It also showed what people will endure and sacrifice for freedom, for their comrades, for future
World War II was humanity at its worst and its best. It showed what people will do to each other in the name of ideology, race, or national glory. It also showed what people will endure and sacrifice for freedom, for their comrades, for future generations. The war's veterans, those who landed on Normandy's beaches, who fought in Stalingrad's ruins, who survived the death camps, who rebuilt from ashes, they understood something profound about human nature and history that their descendants must not forget. The war killed over 70 million people. Every one was an individual with hopes, fears, loved ones, dreams that ended in violence. They died in battles whose names are now legendary, in cities reduced to rubble, in concentration camps, in the flash of atomic bombs, in 1,000 anonymous places. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as human beings. Their deaths demand that we work to prevent such catastrophe from happening again. The world that emerged from World War II was imperfect, divided, traumatized, facing new threats. But it was a world where fascism had been defeated, where the principle of universal human rights was proclaimed, where nations attempted to cooperate rather than constantly warring. It was a world that could imagine a better future, born from the ashes of the worst conflict in human history. As we face contemporary challenges, rising nationalism, international tensions, weapons of mass destruction, climate change, pandemics, the lessons of World War II remain urgently relevant. The war teaches us that problems ignored don't disappear. They grow. That propaganda and hatred can lead to genocide. That courage and unity can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. That the cost of war is always higher than anyone expects. That peace must be actively maintained, never taken for granted. The generation that fought World War II is often called the greatest generation, a label they generally disliked, feeling they had simply done what circumstances demanded. They didn't seek glory. They sought to survive, to protect their comrades, to return home. But in doing so, they defeated totalitarianism, preserved democracy, and shaped the modern world. Their legacy is our world, imperfect, endangered, but free. Their sacrifice demands that we preserve and build upon what they achieved, that we never forget the cost of freedom, that we remain vigilant against tyranny in all its forms. The echoes of World War II will reverberate as long as human civilization endures, reminding us of both the depths to which we can fall and the heights to which we can rise. The guns have been silent for 8 decades now. The rubble has been cleared, the cities rebuilt, but the memories remain and the lessons endure. We honor the dead by learning from their sacrifice, by building a more just and peaceful world, by ensuring that the horrors they endured are never repeated. Never again. Never forget.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.